Assalamu alaikum and welcome to this week's edition of BookBytes on Salam Media, our premium book review show. I've had a very interesting project this week of reading the book that we're going to discuss today, The by well-known author Futhi Ntshingila. I want to just mention that I happen to get a proof copy. This book is hot off the press. It's just started being launched. And it's a book that I would say I definitely enjoyed the book, but it also left me unsettled. I have so many questions, and I love a book that keeps me thinking about characterization, especially when we talk about the topic that it's on, which is bringing together a general from the apartheid state and a young black woman who's grown up in South Africa, and she's actually what I would have thought, instead of being his nemesis, just a very empathetic character who brings out his life trajectory at the end of his life. Let me tell you a little about the author before we welcome her online. Futhi Ntshingila is a writer from Pietermaritzburg, the author of Shameless and Do Not Go Gentle, which has been receiving worldwide acclaim. Her work centers on women and marginalized communities. Futhi also holds a master's degree in conflict resolution and currently lives and works in Pretoria. Futhi, welcome to the show. Absolutely wonderful to finally get the opportunity to chat to you about this riveting book, this unsettling book, and this very thought provoking book, especially. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
I know a few years ago we spoke at the Josie Book Fair on your book, Do Not Go Gentle. And back then, also, I was so taken by your method and your skill as a writer for bringing out very empathetic characters in difficult circumstances. You definitely do that. I'm going to quickly read a bit. Um, so, your character, your protagonist, Hans van Rooyen, is a former police general raised by two women who survived the 1899 South African War. He finds himself being cared for in an old age home by the daughter of liberation struggle activist Zoey Zondi. And she's tasked to take care of this old man, and her gentle and compassionate nature prompts Hans to review his decision to go to the grave with all his secrets. Now, I want to talk about characterization. When you bring together, I find it in the beginning, I found it difficult to empathize with Hans van Rooyen because he brings himself out, and as a writer, you have to put yourself into his shoes. I found that fascinating because it takes a lot and it speaks to your skill as a writer. Tell us about writing the character of Hans van Rooyen.
Yeah. I'm not surprised you found it hard to empathize with Hans. A lot of people who've read the book are having the same reaction. And I think the reactions that we are having is an indicator to the traumas we've had as South Africans around the, how do you say it, elephant in the room that we don't talk about, which is apartheid. So, I mean, hearing the reviews and hearing people's perceptions of the book, it's made me also just realize that we've dealt with a lot and that we don't talk about. And so when you confronted with this supposedly hated character, it becomes a visceral feeling, so to say. So I think even for me as a writer writing, if you look at how Zoe relates to Madala, she doesn't really offer much opinion of what she thinks of what happens with Madala. But she actually provides a space for him to tell because there is no judgment either way, whether she's sympathizing or whether she's judging Madala. For me, that was important because it was allowing him to actually go deeper into what was going on in his head during the time of apartheid and what was going on at his time in the old age home.
And he's quite honest. He's quite honest about his own reflections in the old age home. I find that he knows he was an abusive man, a miserable man, that he took liberties beyond his allowances. And in the beginning, I almost found it like boastful, and then I realized he is being reflective as he creates this bond with her and speaks to her. Because I really didn't like that. I was like, but this is a nasty piece of work. And that's precisely, that you do bring that character across, the authenticity of his character.
Right.
He's
Yeah.
not a Hans is not a likable man, and then you
Right.
eventually read about his life. You draw those bridges. Um, in some ways, is this an interrogation for you as well to understand the character
Yes, for
whose life
sure. It
was?
it was basically trying to find out what was going on in the head of white men during apartheid, in the head of somebody we all consider a perpetrator or against the human rights during that time. And so he had to be a nasty piece of work because this is what was happening at that time. And I think I had to make him into an old age so that he can have the wherewithal to actually reflect to what was happening then. Because I think if he still had the power, I don't think he would have been talking the way he was talking. Because I think during the time of power, they say you test a person by giving them power. It's the way you react around that time. And I think if I had written about him at his prime, I don't think he would have been as honest as he was as an old age, as an old man, basically having a 2020 hindsight.
I wonder, in some ways, though, I mean, fiction does give you the liberty of reflection.
For
In
sure.
some ways, there's a sense of generosity towards his character because we expect that over time we'll be able to reflect, especially at the end of our lives,
Right.
that we will be able to reflect on what we've done and show some remorse. There is one example I can bring off, the case of the late Ahmed Timur, who was murdered, and then recently there was no remorse shown in his perpetrator last year during
Yes,
the case.
I followed that case actually.
And in that case, there was no remorse, and the
Mm,
perpetrator went to his grave feeling that he was in some way vindicated because, the case was kind of not brought to its rightful conclusion. So I think in
right.
some ways, generosity, but hopefully a sense of humanity that you've shown in your character, Hans van Rensburg, that all might not have, been happy to have slipped out of the TRC. We've often heard in conferences that an adequate TRC is still needed for reparations,
For
for
sure.
healing.
For
What are
sure.
your views on this as an academic and as a writer of this book?
I agree. I think TRC actually just touched the surface of what was happening, and I think in larger scales, I'm not hopeful that there will be a time where people would actually come up and say, "This is what I did." But I do believe in smaller scale of one to one person, something does happen. I'm sure you heard about this woman, Candice Mama, who had to go and speak to what's his name? This man who was feared quite a lot. I think he's called Evil, something Evil. What Eugene? You know this man I'm talking about?
Ter Blanche,
No, not Eugene Theobranch. Oh, he was in charge in Flag Plus. Oh, I can't remember his
okay.
name now. But yeah, there was that actual, it wasn't even fiction, it was facts that they had to meet with him and he had to tell them what he had done to their father, to the father of the family. And there was that forgiveness between the two of them. I just need to remember his name. You would know him when I remember the name. um, he actually came to the France Book Festival and they had to chase him out.
Eugene de
You don't
Kock.
remember this man, Eugene de Kock. Yes, thank you. And yeah, there was this forgiveness happening, a real life experience that happened between these two. And so when people review the book and say there's easy forgiveness in it, I think actually in real life these things are happening, but in smaller scales. So I don't think TRC will happen in larger scales where it's institutionalized like it was when Bishop Tutu was the chairperson of the TRC. But I think in smaller scales, it is happening.
Perhaps in some ways, life has a way of bringing one's horrendous acts to be faced, in some or
Right.
other way.
Yeah, that's
We
true.
believe
That's
that as
true.
well. But we
Yeah,
still
but
do have
I actually I
responsibility.
think with the book, the main mission was not to even explore forgiveness, to be honest with you. And so I find myself thrown into this discussion of forgiveness quite a bit. But
Yeah.
it was more, I think also because I have parents who are I have a mother who's in her 80s, and I'm observing change of behavior in her as well. It's just curiosity about old people entering that last rite of passage. And so for me, I think my interest was to look at, this man in his prime and what he did during apartheid, and what goes on in his mind when it's closed now, when the days are numbered. What is it that goes into their head? Are they remorseful about what happened? Are they even willing to reflect on what happened? And you would notice he had a lot of memory gaps in the end, because he couldn't remember what he did to his son's girlfriend at all. He didn't even remember that he actually has a grandson. You know, it came up as quite a shock towards the end. So it's mostly, I think I was just exploring a human mind, although not of the same color as me, but of someone who was evil during his prime, and what he thinks towards the end of it. But it's been interesting also to discuss the whole issue of forgiveness.
So your broader motivation, speak to us about your broader motivations for this book then.
Yeah, it's basically exploring the human mind towards the end of its life. Are people thinking about the things they did? Um, and even, are they being honest about what had happened during the time when they had power, and what happens now when they don't have the power? And also just looking at the, how do you call it? Serendipity of life, where you sort of, you've made a pact that there are certain things you won't talk about until your dying day, but then serendipity happens, like COVID happened around this time, that caused him to actually get a chance to look at the things he thought he wouldn't look at. I just think it's fascinating.
And the extra time and proximity that they had that went beyond
Right.
nurse and patient, so to speak. I also
Mm,
found it interesting that he is able to relate so easily.
right.
Almost they almost have like this familial bond that
Yeah.
develops
Yeah.
over time.
Yeah.
She
Yeah.
calls him Madala. He calls her girly, which
Yeah.
was first a little cringeworthy, but I
Yeah.
understood that is speaking to their bond from his own perspective as well.
Right. Right. It's I think it's typical of someone who's been deprived for so long to actually feel softness and love small things. And so when he's given, it's almost like a newborn latching into breast milk, basically, and finding pleasures in things he never thought were possible for him. And I think that was what was happening, to actually find himself in a situation of somebody he thought would never be in close proximity with him, and getting into that, having no other choice anyway. There's the children that he had alienated himself from. So now he's finding sort of something that would represent what he would have had, and I think that's why he was latching onto it like he did. and he actually felt cringy as well because he thought, oh, I hope I was using the right term by saying girly. Yeah,
He does, yes, he does reflect on that as
yeah,
well.
yeah.
The title of the book, They Got to You Too, that's also something that he reflects on because of the kind of, I mean, and this speaks to fragile masculinity in the space where
Right.
power is almost sort of shoved in spades onto being a man, being an Afrikaner man, being a certain type of man.
Mm,
And yet the veneer is so thin that it falls
for
off, but
sure.
it also steals from men their ability to feel emotion,
To be
and
human.
connect
Mm,
humanly and naturally with
yeah,
his caregiver, who's an older black woman, and now his caregiver at the end of his life, who's a young black nurse. Speak to us
right.
about the title.
I'm so glad you picked up on this issue of how the way life is structured sometimes deny men from being fully themselves and being able to experience their full emotional range. And I think that in the book, I sort of through Hans explore that area of how they just even, I mean, he's at 80 years old, but there are certain feelings about him that are almost childlike that he never got to explore. And I think the break happened when he broke with Christina, who first utters these words, they got to you too, which means, it's starting for you. The brainwashing and the separation that happens from the authenticity of your feelings started when she pointed out, oh, they got to you too, which shows the break that happens. I mean, in this case, it's a white male, but I think it's this this separation of emotions. It happens for all men of all races. The teachings, the mentality that's given is that a man has to behave in a certain way. And I think with Christina, it's sort of I think she acts as a signifier to show where it begins, and it's downhill from there, basically.
Yeah, the noticing of it, that it's not just a racialized thing, but that
No,
men are humanized,
yeah,
if they must feel like men, if they must be manly or man-like, and it
yeah,
comes
yeah,
through. And he remembers Christina's disappointment with him, so to speak.
sure,
And he also remembers, the not being allowed to her funeral was a big deal for him as well. So
sure,
that
yeah,
stood out to me, that he has a
yeah.
reflection about how he's been limited in his emotional usage. So
Yeah,
that
and
really,
I think
really
it's a
came.
thing amongst men, the relationship they have with their mothers or female figures who brought them up. There's always that bond. I don't think it ever goes away. And some of the bond is a bond that happens between black women and white men, actually, because black women are at the at their tenderest time of growing up, as maids looking after them, and they are at the end when they are caregivers, when they are about to die. So that bond, I mean, it's things we don't want to talk about, and we think they're awkward and we think they're embarrassing, but they are the truth for a whole lot of black women and white men who remember their maids. And it's funny, in dying days, people get to see some of the people who've passed, and I'm sure some of them recall or get to see their maids in their dying days. Um, so I think it's really interesting that you picked that one, that relationship between Hans and Christina, um, because it actually indicates that part of the exploration in the story of how men get separated at certain point of their lives from being fully themselves, and how that bond between mother and son, or mother figure and male figures in this country, is something significant.
And it also highlights the absurdity of racism because
Right.
as much as it's a functional relationship, having domestic care or frail care later on, it's a human connection at the
Sure.
most
It's
vulnerable,
Cradle
as
to
you rightly
Grave.
pointed out. You know,
Yeah,
and so that
yeah,
human connection is actually made more significant by it's being necessitated between somebody who has had to sort of hold themselves back emotionally, but in their most
right.
personal space is engaging in this way with
Yeah,
someone they
yeah,
might be taught to be seen as lesser, and it's not really the
for
fact or the truth.
sure. Yeah, because it's at the most important bits of their lives, from cradle to grave. That was one of the other title I thought of the book, because in their birth, some of the black women are actually doulas and nurses in hospitals where people give birth, and most of the black women are also frail caregivers at the end. So from your beginning of your life to the end of your life, as much as what you're saying, that it's functional, it's actually um, much more for the child who's being cared by this person, because they're not seeing color, they're seeing someone who's caring for them. And I think also there's that attachment toward the end as well, for a dying old person and with someone who cares for them, because they see them at their most honest part of their lives, when they have nothing, all the veneer is gone. It's now you and, depending on your religion, and your God at that time, and your last dying breath, basically.
I want to congratulate you on also writing so empathetically and intimately about and giving space to each of your characters to develop. And I mean, Zoe, if we talk about Zoe as a young woman who's encountering this uh, man who has a reputation for being brutish with the rest of the nurses, and
Mm.
he doesn't even expect her to last a while with him. But she's so
Right.
calm and confident about the way she takes it on that she belies her age. Her attitude
Yeah.
belies her age.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
and Zoe has her own past, having not been taken on with her friends in the activist space and still carrying on in her own way. I mean, that also lends to her development as a person and as a character
Mm.
in your book. Your inspiration for Zoe.
Yeah. I think Zoe is a lot is many bits and pieces of all of us. I mean, I grew up in the 80s. Late in the 90s, I did my own traveling around the world. And I think traveling around the world changes you. It changes your mind, it changes the way you move in the world. And I think Zoe's mindset is very open. I mean, she's actually working 6 months a year because she chooses to do that, and then she travels, and she you know, democracy has its own weaknesses, but it's given her um, opportunities to actually be able to do this 6 months and travel 6 months. And so she's not somebody desperate, coming from a desperate mindset of saying, "Oh, I need this job so that I can make money." For her, it's like, I'm contributing to my country for this 6 months, and I'm traveling, doing my own thing, and earning in a way that I enjoy. And so for me, it was very important that she's in that space where almost showing that she's above all these discussions of holding hate. She's traveled enough to know that people are people, and she's doing what she's doing, um, to sort of hear people's stories because she's curious, and that's the curiosity that she has. And also, I think with this particular patient, Hans van Rooyen, she actually gets to explore her own grief that she never explored before, and that is the grief of losing a child. And also showing how in those moments of desperation, somebody comes up and actually carries you around that time. And for her, it was the Sudanese man who helps her from bleeding in the tube, out of the tube to go to the hospital. I don't want to give too much, but yeah, it sort of just shows you that humans are complex, and they have um, all sorts of stories that you would not imagine just from seeing their faces. And she's that for me.
I also enjoyed how you connected the dots between the different experiences we have, even if they're brief experiences that connect humanity. You know, like the example that you mentioned on the train,
Yeah,
and Zoe's growth is precisely because she's able to notice and reflect and appreciate that. Hans, on
right.
the other hand, has lived a whole life of um,
Without, yeah,
selfishness, and just doing exactly what he pleased and taking some legitimacy from the state that he worked for.
right.
And so that reflection kind of comes late. He's not my favorite character. So,
Yeah,
but I admire that he is very well written. So let me say that.
yeah,
Um, so my
yeah.
bias is very open. But
You're
I
allowed
thoroughly
to not like him.
enjoyed. I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I enjoyed the way that you intertwined your characters and the stories that they bring out from each other, and the way in which it makes sense to me that they had to be together at the end of his life, and that she's a catalyst for his reflections and his remorse.
For
Even
sure.
though I think they're self-serving, and but that's my bias speaking again, without giving away too much. So I hope that lots of people will be picking up this book and reading, not just our generation who understood some of the nuance, but the next generation as well, who must
Right.
see what it means to build those bridges for the
Mm,
future.
mm.
Futhi, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. If you
Sure.
have anything that you want to say before we wrap up, I'd love to hear any comments, and I know that people will be picking up this novel and others of yours as well.
Thank you. I just hope people pick up the book and they enjoy it, and they're allowed to have all sorts of different feelings about it, because I think it's done in a way that I would be surprised if someone reads it and like every character in it. But thank you so much, Shafinaaz. I really enjoyed you picking up subtle things in the book, especially around the issue of men and some of the challenges that they have. So this has been a really, really good discussion for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much for writing it so beautifully and so provocatively as well. And we look forward to seeing more from your pen, and we wish you everything of the best on your writing and your academic journey ahead, Futhi. Wonderful to
Thank
see
you,
you again.
Shukran.
All the
Thank
best.
you. Thanks. Bye bye.
Assalamu alaikum. And so there you have it, Futhi Ntshingila with They Got to You Too. Highly recommended book with very nuanced, very provocative characters. It will leave you thinking, it will entertain you. It's a proudly South African story. And with that, until the next show on Book Bites with Salam Media. Assalamu alaikum.